Hello everyone, I'm here in lovely Bon Air, and if I've got my dates right, if I'm not wrong, I think the difference between my temperature here and your temperature there today is about 70 degrees. Not in a good way. Definitely not in a good way. Anyway, hopefully it'll be warmer when I get back. Maybe I'll bring some of this with me, I'll try Anyway, I just came in from a reasonably shallow, I guess, scuba dive not too long ago. And I thought this would be a good time to talk to you guys about decompression sickness. So when I say I came in from a shallow dive, I did one dive this morning and went down to about 70 feet, which is already pretty shallow for some people. I stay a little higher than that because I don't have a camera with a light on it, or I didn't today at least, and all the good stuff in my head is probably up above 40 feet. Which is actually the most dangerous part of the scuba dive, which I'll talk about in a second. But first dive was about 70 feet. Second dive was probably no more than 30 or 40 feet. And that was again because of light and also because of a huge current. It was exercise. Who wants to do exercise? Vacation. But anyway, I stuck with it. Somehow I make it through. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you about DCS today, decompression sickness. Why not? So the most dangerous part of my dive, actually, all of it's dangerous because you're underwater breathing air. If something goes wrong with any of your apparatus, you're in big trouble, unless your buddy's close or you can solve it quickly. But the most dangerous part of my dive, most people's dive, is actually that first 33 feet. In that first 33 feet, the air that's in your lungs effectively compresses to half its size. That would be if you weren't still breathing off the scuba tank. So what that means is, say people get into trouble diving, even in that first 30 feet, a lot of people say, well, nothing bad's gonna happen there. But if you experience the problem, and most people when they do, they shoot for the surface, and if you experience that kind of problem, typically what people do is they breath hold. So imagine being 33 feet down, you breath hold with a full lungful of air, and now you're coming up, that's gonna expand to twice the size. So sometimes when we think about decompression sickness, we think of it as like really deep diving. It doesn't have to be. And that recompression where you're doubling your lung size, of course, is probably more gonna cause you venous gas embolism or pneumothorax and things like that. But any of those decompression sicknesses are possible. So why does this happen? Well, we breathe what? Nitrogen, oxygen, 70% nitrogen, 80% nitrogen, and about 21% oxygen up here in the atmosphere. And when we go underwater, unless you're breathing nitrox, which is a slightly higher level of oxygen in the tank, which makes it a little bit safer in some circumstances, we're breathing that same 21%, but at much higher pressure. So what happens when we go down is because we're using constantly the oxygen that we're breathing, the oxygen isn't really an issue, but the nitrogen is. If you imagine this bottle of beer, it's the only reason I have this prop here is educational purposes. If you imagine this bottle of beer, you can see that, there's some air here and lots of liquid here, but no bubbles coming out. So if you imagine the nitrogen that we're breathing as being saturated and more higher pressures of nitrogen as we go down, moving into all of our body tissues. It's not getting utilized, it's just staying there. So when we come back up, that nitrogen has to come out of solution. We have to breathe it off, we have to come up slowly to make sure we're breathing off that nitrogen in a stepwise fashion. So a couple of things can happen to mess this up. One is that we come up way too quickly. So we experience an uncontrolled ascent, or we have some kind of issue and we shoot for the surface. Or, and this is hard to do these days by accident, is we stay down too long, too deep, and accumulate so much nitrogen that we've exceeded safe practices, and even if we come up sort of no slower than our bubbles, we are going to cause bubble formation because so much nitrogen has gone into our tissues. So, if I open this very rapidly, it would be like a diver coming up too fast. The air bubbles in there, CO2, whatever they put in this stuff, I don't really worry about the liquid. The air bubbles will come out of here, and that's not unlike the bubbles coming out of our blood or of our tissues in the form of nitrogen as we come up. So if there was some way, not that you would ever want to do this with a beer, but if there was some way to slowly relieve this pressure, slowly take this cap off, then we could do it safely. A few bubbles would probably come up at a time as the pressure slowly decreased here. But we could safely decompress our beer without causing it to get decompression illness. But who can wait that long? So a couple of different things can happen is we have those nitrogen bubbles forming. They typically form in the veins and then progress through the body, or we can get a venous gas embolism. So the venous gas embolism can occur in a couple of different ways. One is that pulmonary barotrauma. The lungs expand and that breath hold, that epiglottis is strong enough to hold everything in, and something gives in the lungs. You get potentially a pneumothorax, and you get potentially an air embolism into the pulmonary circulation that goes to the, depending on where it comes out, maybe goes to the brain, maybe goes elsewhere. It causes maybe a coma, maybe convulsions, and it's sort of an immediate reaction. The other thing that can cause a venous gas embolism is, and this is kind of an interesting, kind of a scary, kind of a cool thing, most of these bubbles form in the veins. So how would that get from the veins to our brain? Well, what can happen is, turns out about 25 to 30% of us have some kind of patent foramen ovale, so communication from the right heart to the left heart, that is either open all the time, or it's open preferentially when there's pressure changes, like when someone does a Valsalva. Now, scuba divers do Valsalvas all the time going down, but we also do the equivalent of a Valsalva when we're climbing back out of the shore, onto the dock, onto the boat. Imagine stepping onto that step, lifting yourself up, you're doing a Valsalva. That can be enough to open up the right heart to the left heart. Bubbles flow through, up into the brain. Not so good. So a couple of mechanisms there. Large amounts, of course, the larger the amount, the larger the neurological insult, or wherever those bubbles wind up, via that right to left shunt. Probably the other interesting, kind of cool, maybe a little scary thing is probably everybody, even when they follow the dive tables correctly, probably everybody bubbles a little bit. Probably even if I went to that that second dive, 40 feet, I'd already been on one dive, probably chances are, even if I was coming up really slowly, there was some bubble formation. What happens is our lungs take care of it. If it's a small enough amount, we don't notice. If we're healthy, got a good healthy pulmonary system, the lungs can deal with a little bit of that. It's when it's exceeded that we get the big problems. So large bubble formation or venous gas embolism can cause rapid coma or death in the lungs. You breath holding, you get that massive barotrauma, you can get a pneumothorax. For some divers, the more subtle symptoms of the bends or decompression sickness, pain in the joints, general fatigue, general achiness is ascribed to I've got a pulled muscle, I've been diving too much, I'm really tired. You can get acuteness form of, sort of a subcutaneous kind of erythema that's caused by bubbles there, and that can be ascribed here. I might say, when I ran into a bug or I touched a piece of coral that wasn't good for me. So that contributes to a delay. I'm getting thirsty here, getting sweaty. I have to replenish my, hydrate. Very important for divers to hydrate. So all of those things can lead to these symptoms being not reported till quite late, and in fact, in some divers, decompression sickness, the symptoms of it don't start to occur for hours and hours and hours later. So it's probably pretty reasonable, if you're treating a patient and they say, I was diving a day ago or I was diving 2 days ago, raise that, even if it seems like a long time ago, raise that differential in your bar of things that might be wrong, because it's kind of a coincidence that those two things go together. Something you definitely want to mention at the hospital. It wouldn't change much of our treatment, but in case they need to consider early decompression for the patient. So, interesting thing about the pain, you know, that classic sort of bends pain, it's often difficult to precisely locate. Sometimes it migrates. And unlike most musculoskeletal pain, it's not really relieved. You know how sometimes you have an aching joint and you're like, oh, it's much better in this position or something like that. Usually doesn't happen with decompression sickness. Treatment for us, if we suspect this, surprise, surprise, is 100% oxygen. The more oxygen these patients get, the greater ease with which they breathe off their nitrogen. So 100% oxygen, if applicable, intravenous pain meds. I mean, if your patient is comatose and that sort of thing, you're going to have to consider all of those airway supports and things that go along with that. But definitely 100% oxygen, IV. One of the precipitating factor, some of the precipitating factors, I should say, of decompression sickness are patients who are very dehydrated, patients who drank way too much of this, especially before a dive. I can't imagine anyone doing that. It's like drunk driving, except just drunk diving. But sometimes people will drink tons of alcohol on a holiday, right? And it's not always good for them. And that probably contributes to dehydration. Lots of exercise after a dive, not necessarily before, but lots of exercise after a dive tends to increase that bubble formation and things like that. So I'm playing it safe. I'm gonna relax this afternoon. You know, safety first. Yeah, so apart from that, obviously you're gonna be alert to and treat pneumothoraces. One of the things people occasionally try to do, not that you guys would be involved in doing this, is they'll try and recompress somebody in the water. So believe it or not, that actually has worked in a number of circumstances, but you have to be very, very expert to do that. So if somebody was diving at 40 feet, that's pretty shallow, let's say 80 feet, and got decompression sickness coming up, you'd probably have to take them down to like 120 feet or more just to recompress those bubbles. And of course you can't treat somebody down there if they get worse. They're in effect going back into the environment that caused the injury in the first place. Yeah. The other thing we used to tell people to do is to place people on their left side with the feet up. And the idea is that puts the right heart here, and that venous circulation will deliver bubbles and will get trapped in the right ventricle. There's not a lot of, I mean, intrinsically that kind of makes sense. There's not a lot of research to back that up. It's probably, if you have a patient who's short of breath or in dire need of oxygen, much better to, you know, put them in the, you know, high Fowler's position we typically would anyway. Whew, that was a lot. Talked more than I wanted to. Anyway, just for demonstration purposes, a little bit of bubble formation there, but obviously we decompressed the beer in a reasonably safe manner. And so now I'm going to hydrate. Thanks for listening.